The history books show you desperate women fleeing poverty, answering ads from lonely miners, trapped in frontier marriages with no escape. But the real story of mail-order brides contains something historians have been uncovering for decades. Before we continue, if you enjoy deep dives into the Wild West, make sure you click the like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more shocking stories tomorrow. Also, please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. The woman they called Clara Hartwell stepped off the SS Oregon steamship in Sacramento on March 14, 1876. She carried one leather trunk and a cloth purse containing exactly $3.40. The passenger manifest, preserved at the California State Archives, lists her occupation as seamstress. Her age is 24. Her destination as marriage to Edward Hartwell, mining property owner. 18 years later, when Clara died in 1895, the Sacramento County Assessor needed 4 months to inventory her estate. The documentation runs to 237 pages. 47 commercial properties, 3 residential hotels, 2,400 acres of agricultural land. Total value recorded at $2,300,000. In today's money, that's roughly $74 million. This isn't folklore. This isn't family legend passed down through generations. Every property deed exists in county records. Every business license was filed and preserved. Every tax payment was documented by city officials who had no reason to lie or exaggerate. Clara Hartwell arrived in California with less money than most people carry in their wallet today. She died owning more real estate than any woman west of the Mississippi River. The question isn't whether this happened. The documents prove it did. The question is how. Understanding Clara's story requires understanding what the American West actually was in the 1870s. The California gold rush had ended 20 years earlier, but its aftermath created something historians call the Great Western Imbalance. The 1870 census shows the numbers clearly. For every woman in California, there were 3 men. In mining regions like Sacramento County, the ratio was worse. 5 men for every woman, sometimes 7 to 1. This wasn't just a social problem, it was an economic crisis. Men couldn't run boarding houses properly. They couldn't manage household staff. They couldn't cook for large groups or maintain clean facilities. The skills that Eastern society dismissed as simple women's work became valuable commodities in Western territories. A woman who could read, write, keep books, and manage a household operation had access to opportunities that didn't exist back east. The matrimonial advertisements that filled Western newspapers weren't desperate pleas from lonely hearts. They were business propositions. Men needed partners who could run operations. Women needed legal access to capital and property rights that only marriage provided. California had passed married women's property laws in 1872, giving wives unprecedented legal rights to own and control assets. Clara understood this. The letter she wrote responding to Edward Hartwell's advertisement still exists in the Nevada County Museum archives. It reads like a job application, not a love letter. She lists her skills, her experience managing a Boston seamstress shop, her literacy and mathematical abilities. She asks specific questions about the boarding house revenues, number of rooms, and current debt situation. Edward's response promised her a half share in profits. What he didn't mention was that the boarding house was failing, drowning in $400 of debt, and about to be foreclosed on by the Merchants Bank of Sacramento. The deception would prove to be Edward Hartwell's biggest mistake, but to understand why, we need to examine what these matrimonial arrangements actually were. Hollywood has sold us a narrative of desperate women and lonely frontiersmen, finding love through the mail. The historical record tells a completely different story. The Sacramento Union and San Francisco Chronicle from 1875 and 1876 contain dozens of matrimonial advertisements. The Nevada County Museum has preserved entire collections of these notices. Reading them is like browsing business opportunity listings, not personal ads. One advertisement from July 1875 reads, Mining property owner seeks capable woman to manage boarding house operation. Must be literate, experienced in household accounts, willing to relocate to Sacramento. Share of profits negotiable. Another from September 1875. Freight company operator requires partner skilled in bookkeeping and customer relations. Marriage necessary for legal property arrangements. No romantic expectations. Serious business inquiries only. These weren't love letters. They were job postings that happened to require a marriage certificate. The reasons were purely practical and legal. A man couldn't hire a female business partner and house her without destroying both their reputations. He couldn't give her legal authority to sign contracts or access bank accounts. But a wife? California's 1872 Married Women's Property Law gave wives the right to own property separately, control their own earnings, and enter into contracts. Marriage wasn't about companionship. It was the only legal framework that allowed business partnerships between men and women. Edward Hartwell's advertisement appeared in the Sacramento Union on February 3, 1876. The full text, preserved in newspaper archives, promised established boarding house operation, 12 rooms, stable income, seeking educated woman to manage daily operations and household accounts, half share of profits, must be prepared for frontier conditions. Clara's response, written on February 18th and now archived at the California Historical Society, demonstrates exactly why she succeeded where others might have failed. She didn't write about her hopes for marriage or describe her personal qualities. She wrote a business proposal. She detailed her 6 years of experience managing a seamstress shop in Boston that employed 4 women and served 30 regular clients. She described her bookkeeping system, her inventory management methods, and her approach to customer relations. She asked Edward specific questions that reveal her understanding of boarding house economics. What were his current occupancy rates? What did he charge per room per week? What were his food costs per tenant? Who were his suppliers and what terms had he negotiated? How many employees did he have and what were their wages? Most importantly, Clara asked to see his account books before agreeing to travel west. She wanted documentation of revenues and expenses for the previous 12 months. Edward sent her a single page of figures that showed steady profits and healthy reserves. Clara had no way of knowing that this page represented Edward's wishful thinking, rather than actual accounts. When Clara stepped off that steamship in Sacramento on March 14, 1876, she expected to find a functioning business that needed better management. What she found instead was a disaster. The boarding house had 12 rooms, true enough, but 3 rooms had roof damage from winter rains. 2 rooms were occupied by miners who hadn't paid rent in 6 weeks. The kitchen stove was broken. The building owed $400 to the Merchants Bank of Sacramento, with foreclosure proceedings scheduled for April 30th. Edward met her at the dock with a wagon and an apology. He explained that business had been harder than expected, that the debt was temporary, that everything would improve once she took over management. Clara spent that first night in Sacramento examining Edward's actual account books, the real ones he'd hidden until after her arrival. She could have left. California law allowed women to file for divorce on grounds of fraud and misrepresentation. The documentation of Edward's deceptive advertisement would have supported her case. She could have taken the next steamship back to San Francisco, back to Boston, back to the limited but predictable life she'd known. Instead, Clara made Edward a different offer. She told Edward that she would save the boarding house from foreclosure, but from that moment forward, she controlled every business decision. Edward would continue working his mining claims in the foothills. Clara would run the operation. He agreed, probably because he was 3 weeks away from losing everything anyway and had no better options. What happened next is documented in Clara's business ledgers, now preserved at the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley. These aren't casual household accounts. These are professional bookkeeping records that would meet modern accounting standards. Every transaction recorded, every penny tracked, every supplier invoice filed and cross-referenced. Clara spent her first week conducting what business analysts today would call a comprehensive operational audit. She discovered that Edward had been charging $7 per week for rooms when comparable boarding houses charged $10. He was losing money on every miner who ate meals because he'd calculated food costs incorrectly. His suppliers were overcharging him by roughly 40% because Edward couldn't read invoices well enough to catch mathematical errors. The problem was simple. Edward could barely read. He'd learned enough literacy to function in basic business, but complex documents confused him. He'd been signing invoices without understanding the numbers. He'd been accepting verbal price quotes from suppliers without verifying them against written contracts. His suppliers realized this and adjusted their prices accordingly. Clara had completed 6 years of formal schooling in Boston, unusual for a working-class woman, but not unheard of in New England cities that valued education. She could read contract language. She could calculate percentages and profit margins in her head. She could spot accounting discrepancies at a glance. Within 2 weeks, Clara had renegotiated contracts with every supplier. She showed them Edward's old invoices beside comparable prices from their competitors. She pointed out mathematical errors in their billing. She made it clear that from now on, every invoice would be verified against written price agreements, and any discrepancies would result in immediate termination of business relationships. The suppliers adjusted their prices. Clara's food costs dropped by 38% in 1 month. Next, she restructured the room pricing. Instead of Edward's flat $7 rate, Clara introduced tiered pricing based on room quality and location. Rooms with good light and views cost $12 per week. Rooms with minor damage cost $8. She offered weekly rates, monthly rates, and long-term contracts with progressively lower per-week costs. This pricing model, preserved in her ledgers, shows sophisticated understanding of price discrimination and customer segmentation that business schools wouldn't formalize until decades later. The boarding house had 12 rooms. Under Edward's management, average occupancy was 7 rooms, generating $49 per week. Under Clara's restructured pricing and management, she maintained 10-room occupancy at an average rate of $9.50 per room. $95 per week, nearly double Edward's revenue from the same physical space. But Clara's real innovation was in the meal service. Edward had been including meals with room rates, a common practice that destroyed profit margins. Clara separated them. Rooms were one price, meals were separate. Tenants could buy meal tickets in advance at a discount or pay per meal at a higher rate. This gave miners flexibility while giving Clara predictable food cost planning. The result was documented in her monthly financial summaries. In March 1876, the boarding house lost $63. In April, it lost $22. In May, it made $18 profit. By August 1876, the boarding house was generating $137 monthly profit, and Clara had saved enough to make her first payment toward the $400 bank debt. By November, the debt was paid in full. By January 1877, Clara had saved $600 in cash reserves, and she was ready to make the move that would transform her from a boarding house manager into a property empire builder. She proposed to Edward that they purchase a second boarding house. He thought she was insane. They'd barely saved the first property from foreclosure. Now she wanted to take on more debt. Clara showed him the numbers. Their current property generated steady profit with minimal additional effort required. The building practically ran itself now that systems were in place. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away, another boarding house was failing under circumstances identical to what they'd faced 8 months earlier. Poor management, underpriced rooms, no cost controls. The owner was desperate to sell before the bank foreclosed. Clara had already approached the owner and negotiated a purchase price of $800 for a 14-room property. She'd already spoken with the Merchants Bank about a loan, offering their profitable first property as collateral. She'd already calculated that she could restructure the second property's operations within 3 months and make it profitable within 6. Edward signed the purchase documents in February 1877 because California law required a husband's signature. But the business strategy was entirely Clara's. The pattern that would define her empire was now established. Find failing properties. Buy them cheap. Fix the operations. Build value. What separated Clara from typical property speculators was her systematic approach to restructuring. She didn't just buy buildings and hope for profit. She had a replicable process documented in her business manuals, samples of which survive in the UC Berkeley archives. First, audit existing operations completely. Identify all revenue leaks and cost overruns. Second, renegotiate every supplier contract using competitive bidding. Third, restructure pricing based on market research of comparable properties. Fourth, improve property conditions using minimal investment focused on high-impact repairs. Fifth, implement standardized bookkeeping systems. Sixth, hire reliable staff and train them in specific operational procedures. This might sound obvious to modern business owners, but in 1877, most boarding house operators worked on intuition and tradition. They charged whatever their father charged. They bought supplies from whoever their father bought from. They kept minimal records and had no systems for evaluating profitability. Clara approached boarding houses like a factory owner approached manufacturing. Every process documented, every expense justified, every decision based on measurable outcomes. The second property's turnaround followed her predictions almost exactly. She restructured operations in March and April 1877. By June, the property was profitable. By September, it was generating $160 monthly profit, more than the first property because it had 2 additional rooms. Between 1877 and 1879, Clara acquired 2 more properties using the same formula. Sacramento was experiencing what historians call the Depression years, following the 1873 financial panic. Property values were depressed. Many boarding house operators who'd taken on debt during the boom years were now failing. Clara had cash reserves and established credit relationships with 3 different banks. She could move quickly when opportunities appeared. Her system of tenant contracts represented another innovation that property managers today would recognize as standard practice, but was revolutionary for the 1870s. Clara required written lease agreements specifying exact terms, payment schedules, house rules, and consequences for violations. This protected both her and her tenants. No more disputes about verbal agreements or misunderstood expectations. The Sacramento County Recorder's Office preserves 23 property transactions between 1877 and 1882, all in the names of Clara or Edward Hartwell. But the business licenses and tax records tell the real story. Clara signed every document. Clara appeared before every judge to verify transactions. Clara negotiated every purchase and sale. Edward's role had become what historians call a legal placeholder husband. His signature appeared on deeds because California law required it, but he had no meaningful involvement in business decisions. He worked his mining claims in the foothills. He sent money when his claims produced. Mostly, he stayed out of Clara's way. By 1879, Clara owned 4 boarding houses with combined capacity of 67 rooms. She was feeding 200 people per week. She employed 12 staff members. Her monthly revenue exceeded $600. Her documented wealth at age 27 was greater than most men accumulated in entire lifetimes. And she was just getting started. The fire started just after midnight on April 3, 1880, in a Chinese laundry 3 blocks from Clara's largest boarding house. Sacramento's wooden buildings and spring winds created perfect conditions for disaster. By dawn, 16 blocks of the commercial district had burned. 2 of Clara's properties were completely destroyed. The Sacramento Union's coverage from April 4, 1880, lists the Hartwell boarding houses among 43 buildings lost. The insurance adjusters estimated Clara's losses at $12,000. For most property owners, this would have meant bankruptcy. The fire destroyed not just buildings but the income streams that paid mortgages and operating expenses. Clara's response demonstrated why she'd succeeded where others failed. Within 72 hours, she'd filed insurance claims, secured temporary housing for displaced tenants, and negotiated construction contracts for rebuilding. Within 2 weeks, she'd leveraged her insurance payout and her equity in undamaged properties to secure an $18,000 credit line from 3 different banks. She wasn't just rebuilding what she'd lost, she was reimagining it completely. The building permits filed with Sacramento's City Planning Office in May 1880 show Clara's architectural specifications. She wasn't reconstructing traditional boarding houses. She was creating something the Western Territories had never seen before: respectable residential hotels designed specifically for professional women. Clara had identified a market segment everyone else was ignoring. Sacramento had hundreds of working women by 1880. Teachers, seamstresses, shop clerks, nurses, telegraph operators. These women needed housing, but their options were limited and problematic. Traditional boarding houses catered to miners and laborers with rough conditions and rougher clientele. Standard hotels were expensive and often questioned the respectability of women traveling alone. Many women lived in employer-provided housing with restrictive rules and no privacy. Clara designed her rebuilt properties for these women specifically. Private rooms with locking doors, shared parlors for socializing, dining rooms with reserved seating and fixed meal times, house rules that prohibited male visitors after 6 in the evening, on-site laundry facilities, small libraries, even a shared sewing room with equipment women could use for personal projects or supplemental income. The architectural plans preserved at the Sacramento Historical Society show attention to details that reveal Clara's understanding of her target market. Large windows for natural light, built-in wardrobes for clothing, storage, writing desks in every room, communal spaces designed for quiet conversation and needlework. These weren't luxuries. They were necessities for working women who needed respectable environments to maintain their social standing and employment prospects. The financial gamble was enormous. Clara's rebuild cost $18,000, money she'd have to recover through higher occupancy rates and premium pricing. She was betting that professional women would pay $12 to $15 per week for quality housing, significantly more than the $8 to $10 charged by traditional boarding houses. The bet paid off faster than even Clara anticipated. By August 1880, both rebuilt properties were fully occupied with waiting lists. Women recommended the Hartwell houses to friends and colleagues. Employers began directing new female employees to Clara's properties because they trusted the environments. Within 6 months, Clara was turning away applicants. But Clara's vision extended beyond just housing. She'd created something historians now recognize as an early form of women's economic support network. Her properties became hubs where working women could share job information, business contacts, and mutual assistance. A schoolteacher might recommend a seamstress tenant to wealthy families. A shop clerk might connect a nurse tenant with doctors' offices seeking staff. Clara facilitated these connections actively because successful tenants meant reliable rent payments. By late 1881, the Hartwell houses had become institutions in Sacramento's business community. When families needed to hire governesses, they contacted Clara. When shops needed clerks, they inquired at the Hartwell houses. Clara had created more than profitable properties. She'd created an ecosystem that made women's economic independence practically achievable. And she'd documented every transaction, every innovation, every successful strategy in her business records. Edward Hartwell died on October 12, 1884, in a mining accident in the Sierra foothills. A shaft collapse killed him and 2 other miners. The Nevada County Coroner's report lists the cause of death and confirms his identity. He was 41 years old. He left no will. By law, Clara inherited everything as his widow, but this was mostly a formality. Edward had owned nothing independently for years. Every property was titled in both their names because California law required it. But Clara had purchased, managed, and controlled everything. Edward's death changed her legal status more than her actual circumstances. The change it did make was significant. As a married woman, Clara had enjoyed unprecedented property rights under California's progressive laws, but she still needed Edward's signature on certain legal documents. As a widow, she needed no one's permission for anything. She could enter contracts, take out loans, buy and sell property, and operate businesses entirely in her own name. Within 3 weeks of Edward's death, Clara filed paperwork with the Sacramento County Clerk's office to operate her businesses under her own name. She obtained new credit lines with 4 different banks, all in her own right. She purchased 2 additional properties before the end of 1884. The speed of these transactions suggests she'd been planning this expansion and was simply waiting for the legal freedom to execute it. Some newspaper coverage from the period expected Clara to remarry or sell her properties. The Sacramento Union published a brief notice about the widow Hartwell's surprising decision to continue her late husband's business enterprises. The phrasing reveals the assumption that Edward had been running the operations and Clara was merely continuing his work. Nothing could have been further from the truth. What Clara did next was expand systematically. By 1885, she owned 8 properties. By 1886, she'd begun diversifying beyond residential hotels into commercial real estate. This shift made perfect economic sense. Her residential properties were consistently profitable and practically ran themselves with trained staff and established systems. She had capital available for investment. Commercial real estate in Sacramento's growing downtown district offered higher returns than residential properties. Clara's approach to commercial property followed the same systematic method she'd developed with boarding houses. She purchased struggling retail locations at depressed prices. She made targeted improvements to make spaces more attractive to potential tenants. Then she rented to small business owners using innovative lease structures that business historians now recognize as surprisingly modern. Instead of demanding high fixed rents that killed small businesses during slow periods, Clara created percentage-based lease agreements. Tenants paid low base rent plus a share of profits when businesses succeeded. This aligned her interests with her tenants' success. When they struggled, she collected minimal rent. When they thrived, she shared in profits. More importantly, it incentivized her to help tenants succeed. She'd share business contacts, negotiate with suppliers on their behalf, even provide short-term credit for inventory. The lease contracts preserved in Sacramento County records show Clara's terms. Base rent covered her costs. Percentage payments provided her profit. If a business failed, she replaced it quickly with minimal loss. If a business succeeded, she earned substantial returns while maintaining a reliable tenant. By 1888, Clara owned 19 commercial properties along Sacramento's K Street, the main retail corridor. Her annual rental income exceeded $45,000. Her properties housed 67 businesses employing over 400 workers. The Sacramento Union called her the Merchant Queen of K Street. The city tax assessor's records confirm every dollar of her wealth. Her employment practices deserve particular attention. Clara hired women as property managers, bookkeepers, and maintenance supervisors. She paid them wages comparable to what men earned for similar work, unusual for the 1880s. She provided employment references for women seeking other positions. Her business records preserved at UC Berkeley show staff retention rates that would impress modern companies. Clara had created something beyond a real estate empire. She'd created an economic network where women's commercial activity supported other women's economic independence. Her tenants hired her property managers for consulting work. Her property managers recommended businesses to potential customers. The system reinforced itself and grew stronger over time. By 1889, at age 37, Clara Hartwell controlled more commercial real estate than any woman west of the Mississippi River. Documentation proves this isn't hyperbole. It's measurable fact. The next phase of Clara's expansion reveals strategic thinking that went beyond opportunistic property acquisition. Between 1890 and 1893, she systematically diversified into agricultural land and water rights, investments that business analysts today would recognize as hedging against urban real estate market volatility. The Sacramento Valley's agricultural development was accelerating in the 1890s. Irrigation projects were transforming previously marginal land into productive farmland. Land prices remained relatively low because infrastructure development was ongoing and uncertain. Clara saw opportunity where others saw risk. The land deeds preserved in Sacramento County records show Clara purchasing 2,400 acres between 1890 and 1893, primarily in the valley regions north and east of Sacramento. She wasn't buying premium farmland. She was buying land adjacent to planned irrigation projects, betting that infrastructure development would increase values dramatically. This strategy required capital and patience, two things Clara had in abundance. Her commercial properties generated steady income that funded land purchases. She could afford to hold agricultural land for years, waiting for development to reach it. Meanwhile, she leased the land to tenant farmers on agreements that covered her costs while giving her optionality for future development. The irrigation district records from this period show something even more interesting. Clara purchased water rights separately from land in several transactions. She understood that in California's agricultural economy, water rights were often more valuable than land itself. Control of water meant control of agricultural productivity, which meant control of land values in entire regions. By 1893, Clara's documented holdings included three distinct asset categories: residential properties that provided steady income and required minimal management, commercial properties that generated higher returns but demanded more attention, agricultural land and water rights that represented long-term appreciation potential with minimal current income. This portfolio diversification protected her wealth against market downturns in any single sector. But Clara's most lasting impact might be something the property records only hint at. Starting in 1891, she began providing capital to women-owned businesses through informal loan arrangements. The evidence for this comes from business license records, cross-referenced with property records. Women would open small businesses in Clara's commercial properties, listing private financing as their capital source. Some of these women had previously been Clara's employees or tenants. These weren't charitable donations. Clara charged interest on loans and maintained written agreements specifying repayment terms, but her interest rates were lower than banks charged, and her lending criteria focused on business plans and operator capability rather than just collateral. Women who couldn't get bank loans could sometimes get Clara's backing. The impact was measurable. Between 1891 and 1895, at least 17 women-owned businesses opened in Clara's properties with her financial backing. These included seamstress shops, millinery stores, bookshops, bakeries, and even a small printing operation. Not all succeeded, but Clara's loan recovery rate was documented at 73%, better than many banks achieved with business loans in that era. Clara was now operating what modern business analysts would call a venture capital fund, focused on women entrepreneurs. She provided capital, business mentorship, below-market rent in her properties, and connections to potential customers. In return, she earned interest on loans and rental income from successful businesses. When businesses failed, she recovered her spaces quickly and tried again with new operators. The Sacramento Union published a feature article about Clara in March 1894, one of the few contemporary profiles that survives. The reporter described her as a woman of extraordinary business capacity, whose commercial interests span residential hotels, retail properties, agricultural lands, and numerous small enterprises under her patronage. The article notes her reputation for fair dealing and her particular interest in advancing opportunities for women of business inclination. What's remarkable about this article is what it doesn't say. It doesn't mention that Clara started as a mail-order bride who arrived in Sacramento with $3.40. It doesn't discuss her marriage to Edward or the fact that she'd been effectively running her business empire alone since at least the early 1880s. By 1894, Clara's origin story had been forgotten or deemed irrelevant. She was simply an established businesswoman whose success required no special explanation. This suggests something important about how Western society actually functioned versus how history later portrayed it. In 1894, Sacramento, a woman controlling a vast business empire, was notable, but not unthinkable. Reporters and business associates accepted her authority because she'd earned it through demonstrated capability. Clara Hartwell died on June 7, 1895, at age 43. The death certificate, filed with Sacramento County, lists the cause as pneumonia. She left no children. She left no immediate family in California. What she left was an estate so extensive that the inventory process took 4 months to complete. The estate documents, preserved at the California State Archives, run to 237 pages. They list every property, every business interest, every asset Clara controlled at her death. 47 commercial buildings in Sacramento's downtown district, 3 residential hotels with combined capacity for 210 tenants, 2,400 acres of agricultural land in Sacramento Valley, water rights for 17 irrigation sections, shares in 6 different business operations, cash reserves, and bank holdings totaling $84,000. The estate's total assessed value, $2,300,000 in 1895 currency. Using standard historical inflation calculators, that's roughly $74 million in today's money. Clara Hartwell had built one of the largest personal fortunes west of the Mississippi River. More remarkable than the size of her fortune was how she chose to distribute it. Clara's will, drafted in 1894 and witnessed by 3 Sacramento attorneys, left nothing to distant relatives back east. She left nothing to churches or traditional charities. Instead, she distributed her wealth among 23 different recipients with a clear pattern: women-owned businesses and women's educational organizations. The largest single bequest went to the Sacramento Female Collegiate Institute, a women's school that received $600,000 to establish an endowment for business education for women. 3 women-owned businesses that Clara had supported received outright ownership of their commercial properties, valued at $40,000 to $60,000 each. Another 12 women who had worked for Clara as property managers or business associates received cash bequests of $15,000 to $30,000 each. The remainder of her commercial properties were sold by her estate executors, with proceeds divided among various women's benevolent societies and educational institutions throughout California. Clara's will specified that any woman-owned business renting her properties at the time of her death should receive first option to purchase their locations at below-market rates. The legal clarity of Clara's will prevented the family challenges that often tied up estates for years. Her documented business operations and immaculate records made property assessment straightforward. Within 14 months, her estate was settled and distributed. The beneficiaries began receiving their inheritances in 1896. What happened next reveals why Clara's story nearly disappeared from history. The women who inherited her properties sold most of them within a few years. The businesses she'd supported either failed or were sold. The residential hotels were converted to other uses or demolished during Sacramento's early 20th century redevelopment. Within 20 years, the physical evidence of Clara's empire had been scattered across dozens of property transactions and new owners. The name Hartwell faded from Sacramento's business community. The male business magnates of Clara's era got statues, street names, and chapters in county history books. Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins. These names endured because their wealth transferred to institutions that perpetuated their legacies. Clara left her wealth to individuals and organizations that used it and moved on. A 1934 county history book mentions Clara Hartwell, proprietress, in a footnote listing significant Sacramento business, owners of the 1880s. The name is spelled wrong. The entry contains no biographical information. That's the only mention of her in published histories for the next 60 years. The documents proving Clara's achievements never disappeared. The property deeds remained filed in county records. The business licenses stayed archived. The estate inventory sat preserved in state archives. The newspaper articles remained on microfilm. The business ledgers were donated to UC Berkeley in 1912 by one of Clara's former employees. All the evidence existed. Historians just weren't looking for it. Why not? Because the narrative of Western history focused on male pioneers, gunslingers, cattle barons, and railroad magnates. Historians looked for stories about violence, expansion, and masculine conquest. They weren't examining property records for evidence of women's economic activity. They weren't cross-referencing business licenses with census data to identify female property owners. They weren't asking questions that would have revealed stories like Clara's. This started changing in the 1990s when social historians began systematically examining property records, business licenses, and tax assessments across Western states. They found Clara's story. They found hundreds of similar stories. Women who built significant businesses, women who owned substantial properties, women who succeeded in frontier economies using business acumen rather than luck or marriage to wealthy men. Clara wasn't unique. She was one of many. The same archival research that uncovered her story has revealed dozens of similar cases across Western states. Women who arrived as mail-order brides and built substantial wealth through business operations. In Denver, property records show Martha Aldridge arrived from Ohio in 1879 as a mail-order bride to a freighting company operator. By 1895, she owned 17 commercial properties and operated the largest laundry service in Colorado, employing 63 women. Her estate in 1902 was valued at $900,000. In Portland, tax records document Elizabeth Chen, a Chinese immigrant who arrived in 1881 through a marriage arrangement with a restaurant owner. By 1898, she controlled 4 restaurants, 2 hotels, and a successful import business. Her property holdings at death in 1905 exceeded $400,000. In Santa Fe, business licenses show Ana Maria Gonzalez operating a freight and supply company that served military outposts throughout New Mexico Territory. She'd arrived from Mexico City in 1876 as the bride of a struggling wagon master. By 1890, she employed 42 drivers and operated 19 freight wagons. Her business records show annual revenues exceeding $70,000. These aren't cherry-picked exceptional cases. These are examples from systematic research examining property records, business licenses, tax assessments, and court documents across Western states. Similar stories appear in dozens of cities and towns. The pattern is consistent. Women arrived west through matrimonial arrangements. They applied business skills and literacy to frontier economic opportunities. They built wealth that often exceeded what men achieved. So why did these stories disappear from popular history? The reasons are both simple and complex. First, many of these women left no descendants to preserve their stories. Clara, Martha, and Anna Maria all died childless. Their wealth dispersed among beneficiaries who had no sentimental attachment to preserving their patron's legacy. Second, the physical evidence of their businesses disappeared quickly. Buildings were sold, demolished, or repurposed. Business names changed. Within a generation, the material traces of their activities vanished from streetscapes and directories. Third, early historians weren't asking questions that would have revealed these stories. When researchers in the 1920s through 1960s studied Western history, they focused on themes that matched their cultural assumptions: expansion, violence, male entrepreneurship, and political development. They examined military records, territorial government documents, and newspaper coverage of sensational events. They didn't systematically review property records, business licenses, or tax assessments. Fourth, the sources that preserved women's business activities weren't centralized or easily accessible. Property deeds were filed in county offices, business licenses in city archives, tax records in state repositories, newspaper coverage scattered across dozens of publications. No single source told complete stories. Researchers had to cross-reference multiple record types to reconstruct individual women's activities. But perhaps most importantly, these stories didn't fit the narratives that American culture wanted to tell about the West. The mail-order bride narrative evolved into a story about desperate women and lonely men finding companionship on the frontier, romance, hardship, and traditional gender roles. Stories about women using marriage as a business tool and building commercial empires contradicted the sentimental version. They made marriage look transactional and women look calculating rather than romantic and domestic. Modern historians examining Western women's economic activity have had to fight against assumptions that women in the past lacked ambition, capability, or opportunity. When researchers find evidence of women's business success, there's sometimes skepticism about whether the women really controlled these enterprises or whether husbands were the real operators. The documents prove otherwise. Clara's business ledgers show her handwriting and her signature on every page. Her property deeds show her appearing before judges to verify transactions. Her business licenses list her as sole proprietor. The evidence is unambiguous for researchers willing to examine it. The same applies to Martha, Elizabeth, Anna Maria, and dozens of other women whose stories are emerging from archival research. The documentation exists. Court records, property deeds, business licenses, and tax assessments don't lie about who owned what and who controlled business operations. Women's signatures on legal documents prove their direct involvement. Bank records showing loans in women's names prove their financial independence. What's emerging from this research is a very different picture of frontier women's economic lives than popular history has portrayed. Yes, conditions were hard. Yes, opportunities were limited by legal and social restrictions. But within those constraints, many women built substantial economic success using intelligence, business acumen, and the specific opportunities that Western territories provided. The bigger truth about mail-order brides challenges everything popular culture has taught us. These weren't desperate women fleeing poverty with no options. They were women making calculated decisions about how to access economic opportunities unavailable to them in eastern states. Consider the actual conditions that made these arrangements rational. In 1870s, eastern cities, unmarried women had limited employment options. Domestic service, factory work, or seamstress shops paid subsistence wages. Professional opportunities like teaching required connections and credentials most women couldn't obtain. Property ownership was nearly impossible. Starting a business required capital women couldn't access and social permissions rarely granted. Western territories offered a completely different economic environment. Married women's property laws gave wives unprecedented rights to own assets and control earnings. The shortage of women created high demand for domestic labor and household management skills. Property was relatively cheap and credit relatively accessible for established residents. Social structures were fluid enough that capability mattered more than family background. The matrimonial advertisements weren't distress calls, they were networking opportunities. Women with business skills could identify men who needed those skills and negotiate arrangements that provided legal protection, capital access, and business partnerships. The system was transactional, yes, but transaction doesn't mean exploitation when both parties benefit from the arrangement. This doesn't mean these marriages were easy or that all women succeeded. The historical record shows plenty of failure, hardship, and exploitation, but it also shows numerous cases of women using these arrangements to build economic independence that would have been impossible in traditional Eastern society. Clara Hartwell represents the success end of the spectrum, but even more modest achievements were significant for women of her era. What modern historians are discovering is that women's economic contributions to Western development were far more substantial than previously recognized. Women didn't just support male pioneers. They built businesses, owned properties, and created commercial networks that were essential to frontier economic development. The evidence was always in the archives. Researchers just needed to look for it systematically. The implications of this research extend beyond historical accuracy. The narrative of helpless frontier women serves nobody. It diminishes the real achievements of women like Clara, who built genuine business empires through intelligence and hard work. It distorts our understanding of how Western economies actually developed. It teaches contemporary audiences that women in the past had no agency, no ambition, and no capability beyond domestic roles. The documented reality is far more interesting and far more empowering. Women throughout history found ways to build economic independence within whatever constraints their societies imposed. In the American West, some women used marriage as a legal tool to access opportunities that Eastern society denied them. They succeeded not through luck or feminine wiles, but through the same business acumen that made male entrepreneurs successful. The fact that it took historians over a century to properly examine these stories reveals the power of narrative assumptions. We see what we expect to see. Early historians expected to find stories about male pioneers and Western violence. They found those stories because that's what they looked for. They missed the property records, business licenses, and tax assessments that told different stories because those sources didn't fit their expectations. Modern historians examining the same archives with different questions are finding evidence that was always there. Clara Hartwell's estate inventory sat in California State Archives for 90 years before historians recognized its significance. Her business ledgers were donated to UC Berkeley in 1912 and largely ignored until the 1990s, when researchers began systematically studying women's economic activities in Western states. The evidence was never hidden. It was just invisible to researchers asking the wrong questions. Property records don't disappear. Business licenses don't vanish. Court documents remain filed. Bank records persist. The archive preserves what happened. Historians just have to examine it without preconceptions about what frontier women could or couldn't achieve. Clara Hartwell arrived in Sacramento in 1876 with $3.40. She died in 1895, owning more real estate than any woman west of the Mississippi. This isn't legend. This isn't family mythology. This is documented fact proven by 237 pages of estate inventory, hundreds of property deeds, decades of business licenses, and immaculate business ledgers that tracked every transaction of her empire. The evidence was always there. Someone just had to look. The question now is, what other stories are sitting in archives waiting for historians to ask? The right questions. If you found this story as mind-blowing as we did, smash that like button and subscribe, because next week we're bringing you the documented truth about black cowboys who actually ran the Western cattle industry. The history books got that